All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a discussion. This is a discussion that we're going to be having, especially for fans of fantasy who are interested in branching out a little bit into some medieval literature, particularly medieval literature that we feel is going to be very fitting for fantasy fans. So medieval literature that is geared toward the fantastic and probably has inspired many a modern fantasy writer as well. So joining me today is someone who is so appropriate for this conversation. The other person I know on in fantasy YouTube who loves medieval literature, and that is Liam from Liam's Lyceum. Hello, Liam. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Philip, for having me on.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Have enjoyed a lot of your videos. Of course, I will put a link in the description to your channel. But Liam, if you don't know his channel already, is very well read in not just medieval literature, but in fantasy. I would say that you're one of the individuals I see out there who is more knowledgeable about some of the older fantasy as well, some of the sword and sorcery stuff that very few people talk about these days. So if you want to check out somebody with a breadth of knowledge and an appreciation for the fantasy genre in a broad sense, then I would say check out his channel, everybody. But we are here today to talk about medieval literature for fantasy fans. So let's just get started here, Liam. Are you ready?
I think I'm ready.
All right. So, lest I forget it, let's begin with something from Old French, the Les Chansons de Roland, which I think if you can read some French, you should try to tackle it in Old French. It does help, maybe if you know some Latin and some French, I guess, maybe. But of course, there are many great modern translations. Liam, you have a couple copies with you, right, to show us?
Yes, yes. So I do have a modern English translation. This is done by Robert Harrison. Um,
Okay.
and then I have a modern translation into French. I don't remember who did this one, but there's also it side by side with the Old French. So,
Cool. That one has the old French and the modern French. So that's kind of
mhm.
what I read when I was reading that the last time I read it, which was quite a while ago. But I read it in Old French with modern French, separate book, but I was able to consult the modern French to help me figure out the Old French. But tell us what you love about Le Chanson de Roland. We'll give people a sense of what this is about. It's not exactly fantasy. It doesn't lean on the fantastic, but it's an epic story though, isn't it? A story of basically bravery and courage, loyalty. You have the title character Roland, who is the rear guard of Charlemagne's troops that get ambushed, and he is basically in a fight to the death to defend the rest of the army, more or less, right?
Right. Yeah. I believe it takes place near the border of modern day France and Spain.
Correct.
Um, and that yeah, pretty much exactly as you said. It's about Roland, paladin of Charlemagne, which is a nice knightly chivalric character. And it's pretty much the national epic of France, actually. So while not super fantastic in a sense, it is very epic. Um, it is very brutal, actually, as far as
Yeah.
like the fighting goes. In some parts, very dark, but
Yeah.
very short though as well. Pretty easy to get through and to read,
Yeah.
particularly in really any modern English translation. Like you said, if you have some knowledge of French or even of Latin, I think it would help if you wanted to try the old French out. Um, and I think this would resonate with a lot of modern fantasy readers just because of uh, its style, pretty much.
It's kind of a 300 style story, isn't it?
Yeah,
The sort of a desperate stand. You know it's going to end badly for the heroes, but they're going to just keep going in the face of certain doom. That kind of a story, right?
right. Yeah, no, that's a good comparison, actually. It's 300, so.
Yeah. Cool. Slightly different setting, but the same concept, really.
Mhm.
All right, awesome. Well, of course, everyone knows that I'm going to talk about Beowulf. Everybody's tired of me talking about Beowulf, so I'm going to let you talk about Beowulf. And I'm just holding up the translation by Tom Shippey. and Leonard Nydorf, which is fairly recent and is a translation I completely recommend. In fact, it is a facing page Old English with the modern translation by Shippey, which is actually excellent, really good for getting out the meaning. And there's all kinds of wonderful essays in here. So just a little
Mhm.
endorsement from me. You've read this translation as well, Liam. So
Yeah, I have it
your
right here.
thoughts?
So,
Ta-da! Yeah, okay.
yeah. So, yeah, I have several copies of Beowulf, just like I'm sure you do. So,
Oh
I
yeah.
grabbed
Oh,
that
too
one.
many, too
off-
many. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I don't think it's actually. I think it's more of a virtue to talk about Beowulf too much, if
Well,
such a
that's because
thing.
you have excellent taste.
Yes, right. No, uh, I'll take that one. But yeah, Beowulf is just it's interesting because a lot of people would just say it's kind of like this monster story. Um, it's earlier medieval, right? We generally when people think of medieval, they're thinking more high medieval, which is the Song of Roland more like. Um, but Beowulf is early medieval, and it kind of has this aspects of chivalry that you can kind of see in there. You know, maybe that's why well, Beowulf ends up where he does at the end of the story, right? There's a lot of ways to interpret Beowulf. There's a lot of interesting ways to look at Beowulf, whether just as Tolkien argued, as art, as poetry, or for historical, like through a historical lens, and looking for information through it. But strictly, like just at face value, it's entertaining. Um, and you can find lots of translations. Some are easier to read than other ones. I mean, I've read the William Morris translation, which is a little archaic
Oh,
for
that's
sure.
like you need a
Uh,
translation for the translation.
yeah, so and but there's other ones like there's the one that came out recently, is it Heedley, I think, that opens with bro. The ongoing argument on how to translate what, which is the first word
Yeah.
in the poem, and just a lot of different things. I mean, we only have one manuscript, right? Extant manuscript, so just different versions, right? And like in Tom Shippey's, there's a mistake, right, in like line 6, I think, or something 5 maybe. And Shippey will include that emendation, most will not, right? So I mean, like you're kind of getting a slightly different story, but in reality, it's more of just a story of Beowulf fighting 3 monsters: Grendel, Grendel's mother, and a dragon. And who doesn't like dragon stories? If not, even if the other two don't float your boat. So
Beautiful. And in addition, though, to that main narrative, which is the bones of the story, there's also all these side stories, which may seem extraneous to someone coming to it for the first time, but I've always maintained that they're actually central to the themes of Beowulf. And this is a story that is essentially, as Tolkien put it, a lament for the past. And that is a pervasive theme in Old English poetry, is this look back at what has been lost, at the people who came before us with a type of melancholy fascination, also a sense of honor, and in the sense of honoring their courage, honoring their attempts to deal with this chaotic, often hostile world, and also with mortality, the darkness that looms before us all. And they did their best, and there's something to be said for the kind of courage with which they faced all of that. And I feel like that is something that you get reinforced constantly in these side stories as well. That these characters and Beowulf himself, his act of fighting these monsters is essentially his attempt to put his stamp on the world before he dies. He knows that he's going to be at one point or other one of those monsters is going to get him, right? And so he does his best to do some deeds that are worth a bard picking up and telling people about in the future. So yeah, it's got some deeper, cool themes to it as well, I think. So yeah, definitely one to try out.
yeah.
And anything else you want to say about that before we move on to what I got next?
It's not very long either. So, like,
Ah,
if
good
people
point.
are worried about that, you can find almost certainly some free version online to probably to read and to listen to, I'd imagine. So, if you didn't want to buy one of these translations or whatever. So, but yeah, definitely melancholy is the word for it, but not like in a modern French way where it's just kind of uh, maybe a little bit of fatalistic, but
Hmm.
some some nice sword swinging in between there. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there's more to Old English than just Beowulf. Although,
mhm.
we you wouldn't necessarily know it because people know about Beowulf, at least if they even haven't read it. There are so many great poems. My favorite poems outside of Beowulf, most of them are in the Exeter book, which is a one of the main four. There are four main manuscripts from which we have most of our Old English poetry, and one of them is the Beowulf manuscript. Another one is the Exeter book, which is a collection of shorter poems for the most part, and riddles and all kinds of cool stuff. So that Tolkien's riddling contest between Bilbo and Gollum is not an accident. It is something that he definitely picked up from Old English, his love of Old English, and this is a book that is full of riddles, but also some really great poems that again have that pervasive theme in Old English. Life is fleeting, that sort of thing. So poems like The Wanderer and The Seafarer, but you also have some great, just interesting poems in here, like The Wife's Lament, for example. Some really fascinating. Wolf and Eadwater is another good one, in my opinion. Are there any other Old English poems that you feel people who love fantasy might want to check out?
Um, well, all the ones you mentioned are fantastic. I was just looking yesterday actually. I'm in a Old English class right now actually,
Oh,
and I
how
was looking
cool.
at The Wanderer, and just the opening lines just set an amazing mood, an amazing tone, and then when it like climaxes with that, kind of that ubi sunt near the end, that's just very, very heart-wrenching actually, and very big influence on something like Tolkien, or well, a lot of people who find this influence in medieval works. Um, but yeah, like you mentioned, the Wife's Laments as well, Wolf and Oddwatcher, which are actually both from the point of view of women, which are uh, is pretty interesting thing to look at.
Fairly
They're
rare. Yeah.
Yeah, they're both a little enigmatic, but still very interesting to read. And then uh, another Old English poem I'm a fan of, and this kind of goes along with some of the Old Norse stuff, and that's Widsith, which is just kind of this uh, traveler going to many different courts throughout Europe, um, and not courts that were actually around at the same time. Right, there's a gap in the historical timeline here, but just going around these courts, and most of them ending with some tragedy of sorts. Um, but it's a very short kind of look at a bunch of historical figures, which I think is very fascinating. Definitely, Widsith, I've seen it postulated actually by Leonard Nydorf, I believe,
Uh-huh.
saying that it was Widsith is more likely an Odin character, um, hence why he's kind of bringing this doom to these courts. So that's another one I find interesting.
Does sound like the widely traveled one essentially is
Hmm.
what it means, and it does sound like a good nickname for Odin for sure. Yeah. Ah, so cool. Speaking of Old Norse, how about the Edda? This is the prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. And this is the one I would start with, actually. I would recommend starting with most of what we know about Norse mythology and Germanic mythology comes from here and a couple other books that we're going to mention. But this is a good starting point, isn't it? Because essentially, Snorri wrote this in order to preserve the mythology, to keep it alive for the skaldic poets, and so that they would know what these references were all about. Because by the time he was writing, this stuff was beginning to fade from the public memory. It was a couple hundred years after Iceland had begun to be Christianized. That began in 1000. And Snorri was basically concerned that, oh, we're losing a lot of this knowledge now that we've been Christian for a couple hundred years now, 200-300 years. So he wrote this as a kind of a reminder, a guidebook for skaldic poets. Very convenient if you want to learn about Norse mythology, right?
Yeah, and it's this, yeah, like you said, is pretty much the place you want to start. It has all the, well, great information, and it's really great that it survives, honestly, that we
Yeah.
have so much just from that. And It's which is interesting, right? Because I mean, a lot of you don't get you just get hints kind of when you're reading like Old English stuff of this like Germanic or even just pagan past in general. Um, this is much more overt, right? It's the stories, right? And while written later down, more you could say like maybe closer to high medieval period, definitely has this earlier, older feel. It's kind of mythological in a sense, right? Kind of like if you take like the Irish myths, like the Thoin or something, right?
Yeah,
Written down later, but an older story. And definitely entertaining to say the least. And this stuff actually pops up all the time, I feel like, in fantasy, just like small
all
bits
the
of it.
time.
So
Neil Gaiman as a writer is famous for loving the Norse stuff. He even retold some of the stories from the Snorri's Edda. He's got some retellings that people have enjoyed. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they're just all over the place for sure. But yeah, by the way, this translation that I have, and I do recommend it, is by Anthony Fawkes. And it is that's what the cover. I don't know if the cover still looks like that or not. But the Anthony Fawkes translation, I would say, is pretty good. If you're not going to read it in Old Norse, then read it the Fawkes translation. Quite a few great translations of the poetic Edda. So once you've read the prose Edda by Snorri, you'll have a lot of the context, and you'll be able to better understand the poetic Edda, which is a collection of poems that reference. It's the type of poems that Snorri was trying to help people remember and keep in memory. This is full of them, isn't it? It's got some of the older mythological stuff. It's got some of the heroic era stuff, like the Volsungs, references and poems that reference the Volsungs and other things. But it's just got it's where it's at, really. It's mythology. It's raw. It's enigmatic. It's got this atmosphere. There's poems about the end of the world, Ragnarok, and all of that. There's poems where Odin is hanging on a tree, having speared himself as a sacrifice to himself, and he's spouting all this wisdom. There's all kinds of stuff in here, right, Liam?
right, yeah, that there's just okay. I think of sometimes of like I guess you could call them like Viking fanboys almost.
Yeah,
But the literature is actually so good, so like it's actually worth it. I mean, like there's a reason it's. I mean, like even if you include the sagas, right? It's like it's got this like doomed aspect, very brutal at times, also funny. It tends to be kind of funny at certain times. So I
good
mean, like
point.
very. I think it would resonate with, a lot with modern fantasy readers. Honestly, like it's just uh,
Yeah,
it the style is older, obviously, because it's written about 1,000 years ago. You know what I mean? But like
yeah.
definitely still in some of the actually with some of those translations, you'd be surprised just how easy it is to read and to understand. So
Yeah. And the translation I'm holding up here is by Lee Hollander. There are actually quite a few different ones. I don't know if you have a favorite one or not, but again, in Old Norse, it's cooler, but most people are going to want a translation for that. I mentioned the Volsungs a moment ago, and I would include among fantasy readers, fantasy fans, the Saga of the Volsungs, which is one of the mythological sagas. Now, when you're talking about Icelandic sagas, there are many that are basically domestic. They're about Iceland and the early settlers and that kind of thing. But there also are some mythological ones, like the saga of the Volsungs, or another good one would be the saga of Hrolf Kraki, an early king of Denmark, who is mentioned, by the way, in Beowulf. He's Hrothulf, Hrothgar's nephew. Yeah, this is a great one. The Volsung saga tells one of the central stories of Germanic legend, doesn't it, Liam?
yeah, honestly, I feel like if you were just going to read like I maybe put Beowulf first, but like this is like a close second for me. This is
Yeah,
one of the classics. I believe even William Morris, I think he did a translation of this.
he did. I have it
I,
behind me here. Yeah,
yeah, and is in his introduction, I think, where he said this would be like a story to, basically like the Iliad or the Odyssey, right? It's just like a
yeah.
classic, and it is very poignant and well, rather tragic, but and so,
Well, they
but
loved their tragedy. They loved it.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of William Morris, I also have his translation here. This is the first, it's 3 volumes. This is his translation from the 1890s of the Heimskringla, which is basically, it's Snorri again, and it's Snorri telling there is a lot of history in the Heimskringla, but I'm holding up the first volume because there's a lot of mythology as well. So a lot of the same stuff that you'll see referenced in the Eddas is also referenced in the Heimskringla. And so he begins his history of the kings of Norway with the sort of mythological stuff, and then gradually gets to the early kings and the myths about them, and then we get to the age of legends, and then we get to the historical present. The Heimskringla, great read as well. If you want to go beyond the Eddas and some of the more famous sagas, I would definitely recommend it. And I have my other version here. This is the first part of it in Icelandic, in Old Norse. This is a great edition, by the way. There's tons of volumes of this, of all the Icelandic sagas in Old Norse. But yeah, but as far as modern, I think most people would probably not want to try Morris's and Erica
Right.
Magnuson's translation. It's very archaic, but there are more modern translations of the Heimskringla as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is actually a good example of something that is, especially when you go back into the medieval period, um, with like historiography, where it's like it kind of blends this literature. It's kind of saying this is kind of a history, right? The Saga of the Kings. But late now we'd say it's literature essentially, right?
Yep,
Which is you get with other things, right? Like even our early Arthuriana and stuff like that. So I mean, it's definitely interesting, but worthwhile anyways. So yeah.
for sure. Good. Well, you mentioned Arthuriana, so we're going to switch gears to some more Celtic stuff. And I'm going to start with the Irish myths. I have here a nice little collection of various myths. With the Irish material, you have the invasion myths, for example. You have these early stories of various peoples and races that invade this island one after another. You have the very earliest of the folk that are essentially like elves or whatever, the Tuatha Dé Danann and all of that. And then you have the slightly later myths. You've got the Fenian cycle, and you've got the Ulster cycle. The Ulster cycle featuring the hero Cuchulainn, who is probably the greatest known Irish hero. These are very colorful. I love the Irish stories. There's a very different vibe, much more colorful, much more vibrant than, say, the Germanic stuff, and often just extremely hyperbolic as well. Like Cuchulainn, when he gets his war mood on him, his eye pops out like the size of a plate, and he's just and he'll kill 100 warriors in one sweep and that kind of thing, right? So, well, what do you think of the Irish stuff, Liam?
I'm a big fan of the Irish stuff. It's kind of like you said, it's very different flavor. You kind of see this, well, a lot, obviously, in something like Prydain, which is more Welsh. I mean, you could always take
Yeah, we've got
the
that next.
Mabinogion and stuff. So
Mabinogion.
yeah, okay, yeah. There you go. And Cuchulainn, I think, is honestly one of the coolest, like singular, like figures from anything. I think he's cooler than Hercules. Okay, like this guy is
We'd
awesome.
agree with that.
He's
Yeah.
got Guy Bold. He's got his little Gios going on. Really cool stuff. I really like Helen. All of them are interesting. I mean, my son's middle name, who's just born last year, his name is Finn, which
Ah,
I've kind of said, oh, it's for Finn McCool and it's for Finn Folkwalding. It's for both. But
cool. Good
so,
choice.
yes.
Awesome. Yeah, so we love the Irish stuff. And you brought up the Mabinogion. Perfect. This is the Welsh. These are Welsh stories. They span actually quite a lot of various. You can find some very early Arthurian stories in here, and some that are later that have been clearly influenced by the French material that came much later. Because obviously the Arthurian stuff, we're talking about a British Celtic war hero of some kind. We could debate the authenticity or whatever. Did Arthur even exist? Blah blah blah. But it definitely is the stories of a British Celtic leader who successfully resisted the Anglo-Saxon invaders for a period. And from that grew this it was the seed of these incredible myths that took all of Europe and were basically exported by the Breton bards to France, and it went all the way to Germany in various parts, and there are all these retellings. But the earlier stuff is reflected in these Welsh myths in the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion is a collection of stories, in fact. And some of them are earlier, some later. But again, it has that Celtic vibe, doesn't it, Liam? That is a real keen sense of beauty, along with a sense of melancholy, but it's colorful and vibrant. and just another fascinating look at some very older myths, along with some stuff that's clearly been influenced by the more modern, or not modern, but later medieval chivalric ethos as well. Any thoughts on the Mabinogion?
Well, I mean, I think the tales of, the dead here are gonna probably interest really anyone, but also just the without this Welsh stuff, none of the Arthurian stuff comes later, pretty much,
That's
because
right.
this is the base of it. So, I believe they're not actually 100% sure where the earliest reference to Arthur is, but there's a possibility it was in Ygodothin, or whatever, which
That's
another
oh
Welsh poem, considerably short actually, and you can just find it online.
yeah,
If you wanted to read that, but it's definitely has along with, yeah, the sense of, I think the otherworld sense comes in very well, especially in the Mabinogion. Um and then also kind of, yeah, like a melancholy, a different flavor. I think it's really tied into the sense of identity. Often, as you know, because the Welsh are really Brittonic, right? Or Brythonic, however you want to say it.
correct.
They're the native Britons in a sense, and so they used to cover land that is no longer theirs, hasn't been theirs for a while, obviously, in a sense. And so it has this sense of identity that is
Yeah.
really particular, I think. So,
Yeah. And inspired so many things too. But it's fascinating to see the more native versions of the tales.
mhm.
It's quite different from the stuff after the French get their hands on it, and then it kind of comes to England. Very ironically, that Arthur was so celebrated in England because he was a Celtic Briton who was resisting the
Right.
Anglo-Saxons. So the ironies of history, but it becomes very much a chivalric figure who he a lot of myths and stories and legends just sort of accrue to Camelot and all of that. But that really, in many ways, begins with Geoffrey of Monmouth. If you want to, read some of this was originally written in Latin, and Geoffrey was a monk who could have been partly Welsh, but definitely lived in Wales or what close to Wales, and basically the first sort of compilation of a lot of the stuff that you would recognize some of it if you're familiar with Arthurian stories, and some of it you'd be like, oh, that's okay, interesting. You know, Lancelot was a later invention of Chrétien de Troyes, for example. So there's no Lancelot here. Gawain was the preeminent Arthurian knight before Lancelot took that spot. So you'll see a lot of the older versions of the stories reflected in Geoffrey of Monmouth, won't you?
Yeah, Jeffrey is a he was again one of those guys that's kind of writing a history, right?
He
Which has
thought he
been
presented as history. It's literally called the history of the kings of Britain, right?
yeah. So, so it's interesting, and it's definitely key, I guess, particularly for this transition of more Welsh to this high chivalry type of ideal that we get generally associated with Arthuriana these days, to be honest, unless you're reading some like historical fiction take of Arthur or something, and which are, over all over the place, I guess, in a sense. But
Yeah.
I think Jeffrey, and his is interesting because it was only shortly after he wrote that. Um, I think is when you get the old French version, which is by Wace,
Yes.
Wace,
Race.
his Roman
Yeah.
de Brut, right? And then shortly after that, you get Lachaman's Brut, which
Yes.
is the first mentioning of Arthur in English, actually.
Correct. Yeah.
So it spreads very fast,
Yeah.
which is pretty interesting. And you get different versions of it, right? I mean, like, you're right that it's like England is kind of celebrating this character that fought against the English in a sense. And you can kind of see why it is that way though in something like Lachamans, right? Because at that point there's still a separation between like the Normans and the English that they've relatively been recently conquered, and so they're kind of feeling like the Welsh in a sense, right? Where they've been they're not quite as they're still noble and their past is noble, but they're not quite there as far as status is concerned right then. So that's but yeah, it definitely does well, get an interesting French treatment very quickly too. So
Yeah. One of my favorite, let's say, handlers of the Arthurian myth during this period, because there are so many. We could talk about so many of them. I mentioned Chrétien de Troyes briefly. There's Thomas of Britain, and then there are some Great treatments that go over to Germany as well. I mean, there's just so many.
Hmm.
But one of the ones I really want to highlight is Marie de France. And she wrote these beautiful lays that she herself said were based on the Breton bards who spread these stories initially. Just some beautiful, ethereal, I mean, they're not long. This is a collection of various stories, but L'Enval being one of my favorites. But there's just these uh, it's such a colorful vibe and in some ways very subversive too. Like she took some of these stories and she definitely puts a woman's perspective on them, which I really appreciate from this period. So, any thoughts on Marie de France's lays?
I think that it kind of just goes to show the variety you can get in Arthuriana, and early on as well, right? I mean, it's lays are. I will double recommend this with Philip because I think a lot of people are kind of like scared of poetry. But and a
Yeah.
lot of this is poetry because that's just kind of how a lot of medieval stuff worked. But
Okay.
um, definitely worth the effort in the time. If anything, it's definitely has a sense of beauty that doesn't always show up in the more prose stuff. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Beautiful. And this would have been originally in an old version of French, but this is a modern translation. I think I have here. Yeah, this is a modern translation, which you can find. But start with Lanval. I think is my personal favorite, Lanval. But there are others too that you could read by Marie de France. And speaking of, you mentioned different versions of the Arthuriana. A couple more I want to just raise for people. Most people will have heard of Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. This is much later. This is 15th
Right.
century. But I bring it up because I think this is the form that was given to the Arthurian mythos as a whole and sort of brought together in a way that most people today would recognize. You have Lancelot in place. You have the story as most people would tell. Most of your retellings, your modern like Tennyson's Idols of the King, or even much more modern like Cornwell's story, they're going to be based on the version of events that Thomas Malory gives us here in the Morte d'Arthur, more or less. Now, I actually feel that this is something I enjoy reading excerpts from. I've read the whole thing through, and it gets a bit tedious, to be honest. I feel that it gets a little repetitive with the exploits of the various knights, particularly Lancelot. That's his favorite.
Hmm.
And it's just like, okay, how many times do I need to read about Lancelot's strong arm swiping away 100 men at one time and blah blah blah? But
Hmm.
if you want to read the whole thing through, I mean, feel free. But there are some really great moments in here, like the death of Arthur, for example. Some great excerpts in here, I would say.
Right.
Thoughts?
Yeah. I think Lamort is definitely, in a sense, kind of the definitive version of English Arthur. It's very exhaustive in the sense of all
Yeah.
those like stories. It's funnily like at least for me when I first read it, I was surprised as how much and kind of Lavi Teeter kind of takes this in his newer work by Force Alone. They're kind of gangsters. They kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
do
Yeah.
bad things sometimes. Is this really chivalric? Like it's very interesting in that sense. But it has pretty much all the stories, and you can tell a lot of it is probably coming uh from memory of recitation. You'll hear phrases over and over, like they made great dole, or or something like over and over and over again. So like
That is for sure.
but it's definitely an interesting one. You definitely get this. Again, I think the later time frame of it helps with how kind of complete it feels in a sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, because like you get earlier stuff. I'm sure you'll mention Gowan here in a minute, but and so
Yep.
but I just
Yep.
wanted to mention like real quick. Like if you wanted a tale of Percival, for example, like you get them in a bunch of different ones, right? Here's Parzival, uh,
Parsifal, Wolfram von Eschenbach, one of the great German Arthurians.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. And then you get Percival, which is the Chrétien de Troyes, which is incomplete, if I'm remembering correctly. And then you get like the weird continuation, which is normally called Perilous Vos or Vaus. You can see it here on the side, which is really interesting. I think modern fantasy readers might like that one. There's a moment in it, for example, where there's um there a knight has a shield with a dragon's head on, and is breathing fire on his enemies. So I mean, like, uh, very fantastic in that sense. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no, and I want to point out too that this would have been written in kind of late Middle English, I suppose. But it's the version here is in late Middle English, but it's cleaned up. So
Mhm.
you could get through it. I'm sure there are modern translations out there as well. But yeah. Uh,
I I'm of the opinion of generally the if you can read it in the language it's written in, the
oh, it's much
better.
better.
I
Yeah.
could see maybe Old Norse, Old English being a little difficult, of course,
Yeah.
but late Middle English is actually pretty easy. Maybe it would sound different, but reading it's
Yeah.
generally easy, I think. So,
Not too bad. And this version is cleaned up. In other words, it's consistent. There would have been variant spellings with different words and stuff like that because spelling was not standardized yet.
mhm.
But it's I agree with you. It's much better to read it in the original. One that you probably could not read in the original though is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, simply because now this is earlier than Le Morte d'Arthur. It's 14th century. You could read some Middle English from the 14th century without too much training. For example, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. You could do it, but this is from a dialect that is not mainstream. It is more north and west of where Chaucer was, which was London, the heart of things, where
Mhm.
that dialect had more influence on the language as it evolved. So Sir Gawain the Green Knight, you probably want to tackle in a translation. I recommend Marie Boroff's translation is a very good one. But there are many. Tolkien took a crack at it, for example. There are some, great translations out there, but wonderful poem. It is, to me, the most self-aware of the Arthurian tales that came out of England. It is a story that you can see there's a lot of affection for chivalry and celebration of it and all that, but at the same time there's some self-examination in Sir Gawain the Green Knight done through very wonderful humor. It's a bit subversive in a way, I think, but there's just delightful humor in Sir Gawain the Green Knight, as it explores chivalry and human frailty and the impossibility of living up to all the ideals that are included in a chivalric code, such as you had in during these times. So, thoughts on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Um, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, more difficult dialect, but in translation, especially, I agree. Actually, the Borov translation is really well done, and then I have Tolkien's Hero, which is
Ah,
a very well done too, I think,
oh
but the
yeah,
Borov maybe a bit more accessible.
I think it's more accessible. Yeah,
Yeah, and so um, I think that's actually something when you look at something like Lamort D'Arthur, which is kind of all over the place in a sense, or when there's big battles going on and bad things happening, you're kind of might be wondering what's the point in a sense. Where is that chivalry? I think Sir Gawain the Green Knight has a very it sticks to one thing pretty much. It does it very well. I think it's very, very lovely, the story. Like I mean it's a story, it's not just a like a morality thing. But it is very beautiful when it comes to its conclusion, I think. And I'm a big fan of it. I think it's a favorite, I believe, among I would argue between medieval literature scholars, for a reason. I think it's a really well done. And I think in a sense is kind of like the high ideal of what it is, right? There's this human fault, right, that is really the center of the problems, right? But how do you solve that? How do you deal with that,
yeah,
right? And it's not just slaughtering vast armies or anything like that. It's very much focused on that Gowan character. So
yeah, yeah. Well said. So we mentioned the Volsung saga earlier from the Old Norse material. There is a version of this story, which is, by the way, it's all the Volsungs are referenced in Beowulf, so it's a pervasive story of a legendary story from all the Germanic cultures. But there is a version of it in Middle High German called the Nibelungenlied. And Liam, you have a version of it with you, the
yes.
Nibelungenlied. And this is a slightly more chivalric version than the Old Norse telling, I guess you could
Hmm.
say. More chivalric. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
Yeah, chivalric courtly feels very different than the Old Norse
Very
version, but
stately. Also very
yeah.
tragic, though. And
Hmm.
they're taking the same elements and putting it in a much more courtly, chivalric setting, I suppose you could
Hmm.
say. Um, but the tragedy, the rawness of it still comes through very much, doesn't it?
Yeah, in fact, that's what's funny about this version in particular. This is William, I don't know how to say his name, Wobray or Wobray or something,
Okay.
translation, which is not the original one I read actually, and I'm kind of blanking on whose I did. I think it was like
Okay.
Shumway or something, which kind of retains a archaic style. I like the archaic mode of things, um, but people didn't like, so it retains that tragedy that is from the original story. Um, People didn't like the tragedy, so someone tacked on a later edition, which is called the Nibelungen Klage, or just the Klage here, which is saying, no, we don't like that tragic ending. We're going to fix this as much as we can. Which was written relatively shortly after the Nibelungen Lied. And this is, of course, well, kind of one of the places that Wagner looked for his,
The ring cycle.
his opera. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he actually, I think, took more from the saga version than the Nibelungen Lied itself. But you definitely, you would get the
It's a
idea
mixture,
here.
really. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and that was originally in Middle High German, as I said. I read it in Middle High German, but there are, I'm sure, plenty modern translations. But if you know some German, it's actually funny enough, it's easier for me to read Middle High German and Old High German than it is for me to read modern German, simply because of knowing Old English. But probably that's not true for most people, I guess. But yeah, these are a few. Anything you want to add to this discussion, Liam? We've thrown out a few. We believe that these are stories that if you love fantasy and you're interested in expanding to some medieval literature, some of the stuff that inspired some of your favorite writers, these are stories to check out. Yeah, anything you want to add finally to the conversation as we bring it to a close, Liam?
Um, I can add to that in a sense. One is more fantastic than the other, and they're a bit more religious in nature, which is not surprising considering it's the Middle Ages.
Middle Ages.
One of them is the
Here's
Pierce
Plowman.
Plowman, which is an allegory, like a very strict allegory in a sense, not like Chronicles of Narnia. It's more, the traditional allegory, but it has some very weird stuff going on.
Very trippy stuff. Yeah. It, by
Yeah,
the way,
so
14th century Middle English, one of the great
mhm.
works of the 14th century, in addition to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Canterbury Tales, I would say is Piers Plowman. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And one of the complicated things I guess about it is that there's like four main versions of it, so it's kind of like which one do you read, A, B, C, or D? Right. I think you really wouldn't go wrong with any of them personally. Um, and it's fun, like this version. I think this is the Norton version, a critical edition. It has the side by side, which is pretty common. They're pretty easy to find. This is an older edition. It's not what you'd buy for your English class these days, so cheaper, right? But still pretty much the same thing. Um,
And it's a
um,
really wonderful examination of so it's 14th century, and
mhm.
if you know your medieval history, you know that you had some kind of proto-Protestant rumblings going on in the 14th century, obviously well before Protestantism is a thing, but there are some people who are very much not happy with what they're seeing happening within the church. The corruption has grown up. You have two different popes. You have a lot of squabbling, a lot of vying for power. And this is written by an individual, William Langland, who was a humble priest who essentially is saying it's an indictment of a sort, isn't it,
Mhm.
of all this corruption that we were seeing in the 14th century, but it's also a vision of salvation, an assertion of true faith is kind of what this is about. But it's done in such a dreamlike, crazy, allegorical, trippy way. It's quite a crazy read, really, in many respects.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of some like later early modern works. But then even in a sense, I could see its influence on something like Lewis or anything trippy. If you like something like that's kind of trippy, probably worth checking out at least. Again, you
Yeah.
could probably find it for free online. Um,
Yeah. And probably in translation, because that too is not in the main dialect of Middle English.
right,
It's harder to read than Canterbury Tales in Middle English.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool.
So,
And what's
but
your
some
other?
of this. Oh, the other one is kind of on the opposite end. In fact, some might not even consider it medieval because it'd be very early
Oh,
medieval.
Boethius.
Um,
Yes, yes.
and it's more philosophical, of course, but I think it's just it kind of is a window into medieval thought in a sense.
Consolation
Generally
of
cited,
philosophy.
yeah, generally cited as the most popular philosophical work in the medieval period. Written at the tail end of antiquity or very beginning of the medieval period. Um, Boethius wrote this while he was in jail. I believe it was Theodoric, who was the
Yep.
king of Italy at the time. So
Waiting to get
shortly after,
executed. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
shortly after the Western Empire fell, um, and it is searching for God and meaning. Kind of, it's very, very touching, honestly. Like insanely touching. Like if you like good character work in your modern fantasy work, uh, this is honestly, I don't know if there's very rarely maybe outdone as far as like getting into a character's head because it's Boethius, who's an actual person, but I mean like uh very poignant. So
Oh, I agree. And it's sort of nonfiction though. I mean, it's
mhm.
for this guy in jail, like you said, he's basically trying to figure out life and put some meaning to it as he's waiting to be executed. And it was a very influential. King Alfred had it translated in Old English. Chaucer translated Boethius's Consolation of
Yeah.
Philosophy. So you can see how important it was throughout the ages. So great additions, Liam. Thank you. Well, thank you also for taking part in this discussion. You were the ideal person for me to chat with about this, and it's so much more enjoyable to have someone to chat with about these things. And I really respect your knowledge and how you apply it to what you do on your channel. So I do encourage people to check out Liam's Lyceum for some great content on fantasy and medieval literature and all of the above. So thank you so much, Liam.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I was thinking about doing a video like this again on my own, but it's not like and it's much more appealing when you can have someone to talk about it with. So
I think so. Yeah. Especially someone nice like you. Thank you guys for watching, and we will see you all later on. Till next time.